Hi, good people. How are you today? I'm doing great. Tim Gilbert's here. How are you, Tim?
I'm ready to learn about AMPS.
He is ready to learn about AMPS. Tim's daughter is here in the studio. Amber, are you ready to learn about AMPS?
Yeah.
I can't hear you.
Louder.
Yeah.
With conviction.
That's all we're getting out of her.
That's all we're getting out of her. Samantha's here too, but I don't think we're going to get her to say much. Not much of a barker. Okay, so we're getting a lot of emails here at Next Level asking us about AMPS and the differences between them, and lots of questions that cannot be covered in just one module. You know, so I'm going to take you through the basics of some tube amp stuff, and then we're going to keep adding, like we always do, more and more content as we go on onto the website. So what the amp I have to show you today is part of my stage rig, and this is a Fender Hot Rod DeVille, actually, and this is what's called a combo amp. Combo amp meaning that the speakers and the head, or the controls, the preamp, the power amp section, it's all in one unit. Okay, you might have seen amps that have a separate cabinet with a separate head, and the head has all the knobs on it, you know, the bass, the mid, the treble, that's where all the tubes are, and it has just a speaker cabinet. Okay, that's separate. For me, because I play out a lot, I like the combo because it's easier and it's more portable. I just grab it, one piece, I don't have to lug around a lot of different things. So a lot of questions I get is about, well, what kind of amp should I get? Size, and the biggest thing with amps is you have to decide two things. One, do you want tube amp or do you want solid state? Okay, this is a tube amp, all tube. Tube power amps, tube preamps, and I'll explain what all that means, but all tube. The second thing, I like tube amps because I just like that warm tube sound. This is a tube amp up here. I'm going to show you later, this little practice Fender Champ, and then I have a solid state amp. When we get into the next modules, you'll see what those are and what those can do. But this is just your basics I'm showing you right now. Okay? Now, the second thing you have to know about amps is, especially if you're going to buy one, is, I think, what is the application for it? Okay? You just can't say, I need an amp, what should I get? I get emails like that, and I write everyone back, I need more information. I can't tell you. Do you want an amp to play in a small club? Do you need an amp to just sit in your room and practice? Do you need an amp? Do you like tube sound? Do you like solid state? Do you want an amp that has effects built into it? I mean, there's so much with amps, and the technology is so great, it's awesome. And you go to a big music store like Guitar Center or Sam Ash, and you could go play with them and fool around, and the technology has really gotten really good with them, and I'll explain why that's important in a little while, okay? So when you're talking about amps or getting an amp, you have to know, well, if I just need an amp to kick around to play in my room at night just for myself, you know, I'm not going to take it to ever play with a band, and a small little practice amp is fine with a little small speaker. You don't need a 60-watt Fender like this to play in your bedroom. You don't need a Marshall 100-watt half stack, half stack meaning the head and the cabinet, 1-4-12 cabinet.
What if you're Nigel?
If you're Nigel Tupnell, then you'll probably have like a wall of amps, or Yngwie. That's different. In his bedroom, exactly. So a lot of it is application. Do you want an amp for a small club, a medium-sized club? So you got to know the application, and we'll get into, you know, what amps are good for what size rooms or whatnot. But if you, again, if you're just going to be practicing in your room, you just need a small little practice amp. If you want to play in a band, then you're going to need an amp with enough power to be heard over like the drummer and the bass player. So then you're going to have to get something a little bit more power, maybe that has, you know, more than one speaker, maybe, and whatnot. So two things with the amps at first is, of course, tube amps are generally, and most camps are divided into either like the tube sound or I like the solid state sound. Okay, and I'm going to talk a little bit about tubes right now and the differences. So for the tube amp, the thing that separates the tube amp from the solid state is there's actual tubes in this thing, like the old television sets, and I have some tubes here. Okay, this is the power tube. The power tubes are generally bigger. Okay, that's for the power tube section. There's two of them, or three of them. I forget how many I have in here. I think 2 power tubes. And then there's your preamp tubes, which are your smaller tubes, which are this size. So you have your power tube section and your power tube and preamp tubes, right? Okay. So there's, I think this amp is 3, I should know that, right? I replace them, right? 2 power tubes and 3 preamp tubes. And the thing about tube amps is that, as opposed to solid state amps, is they're more expensive generally, and they also require maintenance, more maintenance. Solid state amps, not a lot of maintenance required. Tube amps, you have to maintain them, and that's important. There's a couple of things you have to know right off the bat, that you're going to have to eventually be replacing your tubes. Okay? And how often should I replace them? Well, that depends. How often do you use the amp? How often do you play out or play in your room? How loud are you cranking it all the time? So a lot depends on it. You know, you might have to replace them once a year. Sometimes you can get a couple years out of the tubes if you're not really driving the amp hard.
How much are they?
Well, it depends. That's a good question. The question is, how much are they? And it all depends on the type of tube. Where is it made? Some of them are made in China. Some of them are made in Russia. And a lot of times, like the amp tube will say, like C. Like this is a 12AX7C tube. That's a common. 12AX7 is a common preamp tube. C meaning this is Chinese. This tube, I think, was about $18 for this one tube. Now the power tubes, and again, this is, we're talking about amp basics. I'm not going to get into a lot of crazy things, but I mean more advanced things, which we'll get to. But the power tubes, I believe this was about $30 or $40 for 2. But you have to buy your power tubes if you're replacing them in a matched set. Okay, that's important. And the reason is because when you're talking about tube amps and you have power tubes, they are basically switching voltages back and forth between them. So they have to be matched. They're kind of talking to each other a little bit. So you can't have one speaking a different language than the other one. They have to be what's called a matched set. That's very important.
So if you have one blowout, you gotta basically get a new set.
Right. Usually you replace them in pairs on the power tube section of your amp. Yeah. Now some amps have, you know, a lot more power tubes. This one has 2. It all depends on, you know, how many sections to the power tube and preamp section, and I can't really say, well, how many does it, because Fender makes so many different amps and Mesa Boogie makes so many different lines, and there's so many different ones. And again, we're going over the basics right now. But just remember, with your power tubes, you want to replace them in matched sets. Okay? This is made by a company called Groove Tubes. They make some pretty cool sounding tubes. And you can play with your tubes, because this is actually a new type of tube that was developed by them called a blackface, which it really goes well with this amplifier. The technology is so great now because you can get different kinds of tubes that kind of sound a little bit differently, and you can kind of play with them and see what ones you like. There's a, you know, some people are so into their gear. There's like tubes that were made long time ago, and I'm not that big on all the old tubes. Like really old tubes say it's like this amazing sound, but they don't make them anymore. So if you could find a set, it's like the holy grail of
I bet
tubes.
you they're on eBay.
Yeah, they probably are on eBay. Exactly. They're probably going for, yeah, they're going for a lot of money too. So, but I kind of like Groove Tubes, and I like some of the tubes that Fender makes. This is an original Fender tube here. I think the original Fender tubes, a lot of them are made in Russia.
Can an average person just take the lid off and get in there? Or
yeah, you can get in there, but here's the thing is you don't want to mess around with your tube amp if you don't know what you're doing. Because tube amps, and they'll say this on the back of your tube amplifiers, they store some voltage. Even though you shut your amp off, there's still some voltage that might be stored in it, like a capacitor too. Capacitors store some voltage in them. So if you go in there and you start touching things, that tube can discharge into you.
You can get hurt.
Yeah, it'll curl your hair, man.
Woo.
You know what I'm saying?
No perm needed.
Right, exactly. No perm needed. So you don't want to go monkeying around with it if you don't know what you're doing. Okay, you want to leave it to a qualified service tech. Now, the other thing that you have to remember about tube amps with the maintenance is, besides replacing your tubes, is the tube amp has to be what's called biased every now and then. When you take your amp in for maintenance, the tube amp, just put my amp on standby. That's another thing I want to tell you about. Don't let me forget about that. On tube amps, they're going to have standby. When you bring your tube amp in for service, okay, you should have it biased, or when your tubes are replaced, you should definitely have it biased. A biasing means it's kind of like a car idle. You know how the idle of a car has to be set at a certain idle speed. You don't want it idling way too fast or it's going to waste too much gas, or way too slow because it's going to stall, okay? The tube amp is the same way. You want it to be biased so it's performing at the best possible performance rate of the amp, okay? So now that's an adjustment you have to have a scope to do, an oscilloscope, and or some other type of meter. So I bring it to an amp guy, and I have an amp guy, real good guy that I use here in Southern California. And to get your tube amp bias is usually about $25, $35, something like that. That's not including if you get your tubes replaced. But if you have an old amp and it hasn't been biased in a while, you're going to want to have it biased. Okay, that's the maintenance on these amps. This amp is about 10, 12 years old, I guess. And I've played thousands of shows probably with it, and it's a champion. It hasn't really gone down on me once because I change the tubes regularly. That's the other thing about tube amps you have to do, is you have to change the tubes before they blow out. Because if a tube blows on you, there's a chance, if you wait to change your tubes for years and years and years and years, and then finally the tube goes, it could do damage to the rest of the amplifier. Because you could do problems to the diode circuitry in the tube amp. If you wait for your tubes to go bad and then just never replace them, and all of a sudden when it blows, it might blow something else. So you want to replace the tubes before they fail. Okay? And you can, again, bring your tube amp in for service and they can check the tubes. And you could say, hey, check my tubes, go through the amp, see if any of the tubes are leaking. They start to leak voltage, and that's what, a lot of times I can hear my tubes already because I can hear the amp, it'll start to crackle. With tube amps, you'll hear this crackle.
That's a good warning sign.
It's a good warning sign, exactly. And if you ask anybody with a tube amp, they'll tell you, oh yeah, I've heard the amp, it's starting to crackle a little bit. Your tubes might be starting to go. Okay, or sometimes with this amp, I know something is wrong if I'll be playing and all of a sudden my volume changes a little bit. I could be like, I'll be playing and all of a sudden it'll get much less. Okay, not like cut out completely, but the volume goes down. And when that happens, that's usually a sign that something's going on with the power tubes or something. The volume starts to cut out. It could be. So you want to make sure you take heed of those warning signs because you don't want to wait for the tube to blow.